When I'm involved in leadership of a school, I'm concerned about leaving the legacy beyond where I leave. I want this to carry on. And so it is very much, and Singapore, the bureaucrats who run Singapore's education system, with whom I work very closely, are all about continuity of change and sustainability of change. Very, very important words. It's not just about bringing how do we change, it's sustaining it. And the other very important thing we haven't heard today, it's about scaling up too. So it's about how do we start change, how do we sustain it, but how do we scale it up across a school or across a number of schools and across a system. Richard Elmore at Harvard wrote a very influential paper about the virtues of backward mapping, arguing that so much reform in education fails because it's always top-down. And what he was advocating was, why don't we actually start planning and both for new practice and policy by starting at the end result, the outcome, if you like. What some people confused about Elmore's message is actually he wasn't necessarily advocating just bottom-up leadership and change, because what he was actually advocating was the planning for change needs to start at the bottom, at the outcome stage. How it's implemented could still be a mix of top-down and bottom-up. That the important stakeholders like government and parents are not going to buy in to the new curricula and the new assessments that are required. So teachers are reluctant to change because they're hanging themselves out to dry, as we say, if they're not convinced that new forms of assessment will be acceptable to employers, to government, and to others. My view of leadership is somewhat different from the traditional notion of leadership, which has it at the top, bearing down on followers. This notion is a derived notion of leadership. If somebody says, so what type of leadership is required in a transforming school, I say, well, let's look at the nature of what the transformation requires, and then we deduce, we build leadership around those core principles of transformed teaching and learning and so on. Not the other way around. I'm not saying that we need to reject the core disciplines of maths, science. Of course I'm not. Those still have to be maintained as central to the curriculum of every school, every system. But what I am saying is, in addition to that, we need to add things like transdisciplinary knowledge, so that in future, for children to leave school with those 21st century learning goals, we need to introduce more transdisciplinary knowledge so that they can better cope with and are better equipped to deal with real-world problems they will be facing after school. Traditional teaching methods do not deliver the holistic education, the soft skills, the requirements of the workforce in the workplace for the 21st century. So here we have a real conundrum. We've got, on the one hand, traditional teaching methods that give good test results and get you flying up well, I'm not sure they're flying up, but anyway, way up there in the PISA tables. But those are not necessarily the instructional methods, colleagues, that we need to address the requirements of 21st century societies and economies. Clearly, many of the holistic soft skills that we're talking about, the 21st century curriculum should be about, do not easily lend themselves to traditional quantitative type tests. So one of the challenges is going to increasingly be how do we make new formative assessment for a start must play a much bigger role than just summative assessment, and then also how can we devise new, perhaps more qualitative tests or judgments to cover these areas of the curriculum that do not lend themselves easily to measurement in the old sense. The need for whole school, not just groups of teachers, but not just groups of teachers working together on subject issues or teaching their subject area, but whole school involvement in tackling something like, let's say it was a school wanted to introduce problem-based learning across all subjects, then that would bring a synergy to the school. It would bring a lot of opportunities for colleagues to learn from each other, a lot of very rich discussion between departments, enabling transdisciplinary knowledge. Many researchers are writing about this now. The more leadership there is in a school and school community, the more the school is likely to improve, providing the leadership is aligned and coherent and going in the same direction. If you have leadership being exercised in different ways, in different directions, it's chaos. When we talk about leadership, I don't believe there's sort of one neat, nice definition of leadership, because the sort of leadership the principal exercises is very different from the sort of leadership that teachers and students might exercise. So I see schools as much more complex organizations with lots of different levels and functions and types of leadership going on in them. You can't expect students, for example, to exercise the sort of leadership that you'd expect maybe from the principal. We have different functions in that sense, different purposes. You need to look at the maturity of your staff and colleagues before you distribute. You don't just distribute leadership suddenly. That's highly dangerous. It needs to be carefully developed and evolve according to the expertise and experience and potential of your colleagues. The model offers flexibility. It offers different pathways. As I said, you don't have to follow it logically and algorithmically, because your school will be unique. It may have strengths in technology and strengths in pedagogy, but not in organizational structures. Other schools will be different. So you have to plan a pathway. So I say the model is teleological, which means it's really, we plan to achieve certain outcomes. That's what teleological means. You design, you architecture something deliberately for outcomes.